Ukraine is being threatened, but European security writ large is being threatened. And you've seen the alliance step up in ways that truly are historic and significant. And I think you're going to continue to see that going forward. If the Secretary said it best, I mean, Mr. Putin is getting exactly what he says he didn't want, a strong NATO on his western flank. And so without speaking to Finland specifically, we, number one, stand up for sovereignty and the territorial integrity of independent nation states. That's not going to change. And Mr. Putin, should he want to violate that in new ways, will find new costs, I'm sure, imposed upon him. Number two, our commitment to NATO is ironclad, and we're going to continue to look for ways to strengthen that. Okay? Let me go to the phones here. Abraham?
Yeah, thanks so much for taking my call, John. Reports indicate that Kyiv could fall in as little as a day. Is the Defense Department doing anything to prevent Kyiv from falling? And then I have a second question.
I don't have a prediction about what's going to happen to Kyiv, Abraham. And as I said, we continue to provide ways for Ukraine to defend itself, both from a lethal and a non-lethal perspective. And the other thing I'd say to that is you can see for yourself just an open press reporting what your colleagues are reporting from the region, that Ukraine is fighting back. They are defending themselves. And as I said earlier to Jen, we certainly have seen indications that the Russians are not, in every case, making the progress that they thought they were going to make. What's your second question?
Yeah, thanks. On any assessments about what Ukrainian air defenses remain intact? Thank you.
I'm not going to get into a specific assessment about Ukrainian military capabilities. A, we don't have perfect visibility. B, even if we did, I don't think putting that out in the public when they're literally being attacked by a neighboring state is a smart move for us to make. Dimitri?
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. A couple of questions. The first is whether you have any updates on the amphibious landing assault near Mariupol. And secondly, some European intelligence officials say that actually half of Russia's combat power that had amassed along the border has now moved into Ukraine. I know in the US there was a view that a third had moved in. Have you seen big numbers move in today?
We have seen continued movement by Russian forces into Ukraine, both from the north and from the south. I can't give you, Dimitri, a percentage of what that looks like. I would just tell you that we don't believe that the majority of the combat power that Mr. Putin had arrayed alongside Ukraine has been employed inside Ukraine. But it is fluid. Literally, the situation changes by the hour. So, again, I want to be careful that I'm not getting into providing an assessment of operations in which we are not involved. And as for the amphibious assault, we do believe that such an assault is being conducted today, but we don't, again, have perfect visibility on the progress of that. And I couldn't give you a blow-by-blow of exactly how many they put ashore and what they're doing. But it certainly appears to us to be of a piece of their designs in the south to further cut off the Donbass region and to from a southern perspective continue to try to take population centers. Karun?
Hi, John. Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me, John?
I got you.
Hi. Okay, sorry. I was going to take myself off mute. Two questions. The first, just to clarify on the numbers thing, I know we were talking about the 7,000 that was announced yesterday, but of the 12,000 that you've kind of approximately you've already been sending over to Europe, how many of those are supposed to be under the auspices of NATO and these new plans that would go forward? And then also, I understand you're not talking about where U.S. troops would be going because those defense plans are still being worked out, the details, but where do you see the potential flashpoints, maybe spillover points where NATO needs additional help right now as you're looking at that sphere of influence, whether or not that's specifically where U.S. troops end up going?
I wouldn't describe locations on the eastern flank of NATO as flashpoints right now. I mean, the Russian military is very much focused on Ukraine, and particularly the eastern half of the country. This is about reassuring allies and sending a strong message to Mr. Putin that we take our Article 5 commitments seriously. So I would not describe the eastern flank NATO territory as flashpoints or having there be flashpoints on them. Most of the forces that we have either repositioned inside Europe or flowed from the United States, we've done on a unilateral basis. In fact, all of it we've done on a unilateral basis. What I said yesterday and what I tried to say today was, of the 7,000 that the president ordered yesterday, some of those will probably be earmarked for the NATO response force when we finally hash out the requirements with the alliance and what that looks like. And it was the Secretary's desire to get them moving, get them ready and get them moving and get them as pre-positioned as possible so that when we have all the requirements in place, when actual deployment orders are given for the NATO response force by the alliance, they'll be more ready to do that. Tara from Defense One.
To clarify, is that 7,000 as a separate silo from the 12,000 that are there that will stay unilateral, or are we kind of cross-counting numbers and pools of U.S. troops?
Talk with Megan. It's not binary. We have the Secretary has shortened the tether on roughly 10 to 12,000. Some of those 10 to 12,000 are going to be earmarked for the NATO response force. Again, it's going to depend on what the capabilities are requested and what's the need, and then we'll go from there. Some of them he put on prepare to deploy orders or shortened tethers simply because he wanted them available for unilateral U.S. action. We have to work this out with NATO, and when we do, we'll have a better sense of who's going where and what they're going to be earmarked for. It is entirely possible, for instance, that units that are in Europe on unilateral orders, depending on what NATO needs, could be moved off of that and into the NATO command structure. Again, we're still working our way through that right now. So it's an unsatisfying answer, but it's an honest one. We simply don't know what that breakdown is going to be. Let's see. Tom Squitieri, Talk News.
Hi, John. Good afternoon. Thanks. I have two questions. My first one is, as well as you understand the Pentagon's view on this, does the NATO Readiness Force only apply to NATO nations, or could they go to places like Sweden, Finland, or Moldova?
These troops that we have provided and that we will continue to look at providing are earmarked for NATO territory. Paul McCleary, Politico.
Wait, John, I had two questions. My second one is, is the Pentagon considering pulling out the National Guard trainers that are now in Moldova?
I know of no such plans. Paul McCleary.
Hi, John. I'm on the line still waiting. If I could get my question.
Go ahead, Tara.
Thank you. How concerned is the building that this conflict could potentially spill over to the eastern flank countries? Putin has not been completely clear what his intent is and whether his intent maybe extends beyond Ukraine. Just wondering if in any of the conversations with counterparts with Russia, have they clearly communicated that their intent stops at Ukraine?
It is, you said it actually in your question, it's not entirely clear if Mr. Putin has designs beyond Ukraine. And it's because that's not perfectly clear that we continue to look for ways to bolster our NATO capabilities and to reassure our allies. I mean, one of the reasons we're doing this is because we want to make it clear to him that we will defend every inch of NATO territory. I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
War. John, just one follow-up. Is there any concern that this could grow into a regional war?
I think there's no reason for it to be a war now. Tara, and it shouldn't have been. Mr. Putin had diplomatic options on the table that he decided to ignore and to invade Ukraine regardless. So there should be no reason why there's a war now. There is obviously one. Clearly, that's evident. We need to make sure, and we will make sure, that it's very clear that we're going to defend every inch of NATO territory. I'm not going to speculate about what the future holds because it is not perfectly clear where Mr. Putin is going here. We want to make it clear that he will not be able to threaten in any tangible way our NATO allies. Okay, Paul, let's try it again.
All right, third time's the charm. Thanks. You said we're going to continue to supply defensive weapons to Ukraine. Is there any consideration of training Ukrainian troops outside of the country for them to then go back in and fight?
I think we're looking at all kinds of different ways to continue supporting Ukrainian armed forces, and we're not taking anything off the table with respect to how that might manifest itself going forward, and that could include some training.
John?
Yeah.
Let me ask. So you've addressed the issue of supporting the Ukrainian forces several times now, looking into different ways, which might lead us to include that your assessment is that Ukrainian forces can actually resist for a long time. Is that the assessment? To be able actually to get that assistance in various ways, in lethal and non-lethal?
I'm not going to put a timestamp on this, Fadi. I mean, but you can see for yourselves that the Ukrainians are fighting back. They're defending their country.
So you don't think that the time is running in a way that it might be too late to provide any type of assistance?
We have been providing assistance for quite some time. We're going to continue to provide assistance, and they're fighting back. They're fighting back in many ways using the assistance that the United States has provided, as well as other nations.
So they're using the assistance.
You can see it for yourself. I'm not going to tell you what weapon systems they're firing on what day and in what location. I don't have that level of fidelity. But you don't need me to tell you that. You can see it for yourself in the imagery. They're fighting back. Yeah. I think that's it for today. Thanks very much. Have a good weekend.
Good evening. Allied leaders have just met to address the gravest threat to Euro-Atlantic security in decades. I invited NATO's close partners, Finland, Sweden and the European Union, to our summit because this crisis affects us all. Russia has shattered peace in Europe. The people of Ukraine are fighting for their freedom in the face of Russia's unprovoked invasion. We deplore the tragic loss of life, enormous human suffering and destruction. Our thoughts are with those killed, injured and displaced. We call on Russia to stop this senseless war. Immediately cease its assaults, withdraw all its forces from Ukraine, and turn back to the path of dialogue and turn away from aggression. The Kremlin's objectives are not limited to Ukraine. Russia has demanded legally binding agreements to announce further NATO enlargement and to remove troops and infrastructure from allies that joined after 1997. We are facing a new normal in European security, where Russia openly contests the European security order and uses force to pursue its objectives. The world will hold Russia and Belarus accountable for their actions. Russia as the aggressor, Belarus as the enabler. President Putin's decision to pursue his aggression against Ukraine is a terrible strategic mistake, for which Russia will pay a severe price for years to come. NATO allies and the European Union have already introduced significant sanctions, and many of our partners around the globe have joined us. We must stand ready to do more, even if it means we have to pay a price, because we are in this for the long haul. At the same time, the Russian people must know that Kremlin's war on Ukraine will not make Russia more secure. It will not make Russia more respected in the world. It will not lead to a better future for your children. In response to Russia's massive military build-up over the past months, we have already strengthened our deterrence and defense. Yesterday, NATO allies activated our defense plans. And as a result, we are deploying elements of the NATO response force on land, at sea and in the air, to further strengthen our posture and to respond quickly to any contingency. The United States, Canada and European allies have deployed thousands of more troops to the eastern part of the alliance. We have over 100 jets at high alert operating in over 30 different locations, and over 120 ships from the high north to the Mediterranean, including 3 strike carrier groups. There must be no space for miscalculation or misunderstanding. We will do what it takes to protect and defend every ally and every inch of NATO territory. Leaders today also made clear that we must continue our support to Ukraine. The Kremlin is trying to make NATO and the EU provide less support to our partners. So our collective answer must be more support to countries like Georgia, Moldova, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, to help them succeed with their democratic reforms and pursue the path that they have freely chosen. More than ever, this crisis demonstrates the importance of North America and Europe standing together in NATO. There is no security in Europe without a strong transatlantic bond. With that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll go to Al Jazeera.
James Bays, Al Jazeera. How fearful are you about the possible fall of Kyiv? How long, in your estimation, can the government of Ukraine last? And if we move to a resistance insurgency type situation, what support can NATO then give?
So what we see now is a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine from multiple directions with air, sea and land capabilities. And this is actually in line with what our intelligence services predicted over a long period of time, because we saw the build-up around Ukraine with air, sea and land forces. We see, of course, that they're moving towards Kiev. We also see the rhetoric, the messages, which is strongly indicating that the aim is to change government, to change and remove the democratically elected government in Kiev. We are in close contact with the government of Ukraine. We are, of course, monitoring the situation very closely. It is still a fluid situation. What we have seen is that the Ukrainian forces are fighting bravely and are actually able to inflict damage on the invading Russian forces. But again, it is a very fluid and evolving situation. NATO allies expressed at the summit today that they provide support to Ukraine. They are ready to continue to provide support to Ukraine, military support, financial support, humanitarian support. And then I think we all have to judge how things evolve. But the message from NATO leaders and also from Finland and Sweden, EU, is that we are there to support Ukraine. We have supported Ukraine for many years and we continue to provide support.
We'll go to the National Press Agency of Ukraine.
Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. Secretary General, in the current situation which we observe now in Ukraine, does NATO preserve its desire to assist Ukraine with defensive equipment? In particular, can we expect that NATO will provide Ukraine with so badly needed anti-aircraft equipment? Thank you so much.
So NATO allies continue to provide support to Ukraine, and it was actually at the meeting today at the NATO summit with EU and Finland and Sweden, allies announced and also informed other allies about the type of weapons, the type of support, and some of that also includes air defense systems. So NATO allies have and continue to provide support, military, but also different types of equipment to Ukraine. Then we all realize that, of course, in this very evolving and difficult situation, it's hard to predict what will be the what are the possibilities in the future. But allies are providing support and are very committed to continue to provide support.
Okay, we'll go to NBC, just behind the cameras.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. There's concern that NATO could get pulled into this conflict if Russia were to shut down electricity or other services in Ukraine that could spill over into Poland or Romania. Can you say explicitly whether a Russian cyber attack of that nature would trigger an Article 5 collective defense?
So we are sending a very clear message to Russia that we provide support to our partner Ukraine, and allies provide many different types of support. NATO help Ukraine also with their cyber defenses. But then for NATO allies, we provide the absolute security guarantees under the Washington Treaty, Article 5. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. And we are clear on this distinction because it is important to make sure that we don't have an even bigger crisis in Europe where Russia challenge or is threatening or attacking any NATO allied country. And that's the reason why we so clearly send a message that we are there to protect all allies and every inch of NATO territory. When it comes to cyber attacks and the risk for incidents and accidents, for instance in the Black Sea, we are pursuing mechanisms of deconfliction to prevent that from happening. We have, as NATO allies, especially the United States, have done that, for instance, in Syria over a long period of time. And we, of course, are very focused. I spoke with Sarkar, the NATO Supreme Commander, on that issue recently, and he is very focused on the need to deconflict to make sure that we don't have incidents or accidents that can spiral and get out of control and create a very dangerous situation. On cyber, well, we have stated that cyber attacks can trigger Article 5, but we have never gone into a position where we give a potential adversary the privilege of defining exactly when we trigger Article 5. We are focused on strengthening our cyber defenses. We are very much aware of that that's a risk, and therefore we are stepping up both the protection of our cyber networks, but also providing support to Ukraine, and we are very focused on the need for deconfliction.
Okay, we'll go to NPR Deutsche Welle. Just
Thank you. Terry Schultz with NPR and DW. I want to know more about the deployment of the NRF forces, please. How many will be sent where, from where? How long will it take to get there? Thinking about military mobility, as always. And also, what has changed in your calculation about the threat to NATO territory that has led allies to make the decision to deploy this for the first time in history for the purposes of collective defense? Thank you.
Well, what has changed over the last days is, of course, that there's a full-fledged invasion of a partner, a country that borders several NATO allied countries. And this is the most serious security crisis we have faced in Europe for decades. And therefore we have the High Readiness Force, we have the NATO Response Force, and that's the reason why we are deploying it, to, again, prevent any miscalculation, any misunderstanding that we are not ready to protect and defend all allies. And of course this is something all allies have agreed to do, 30 allies agreed. But of course, especially those in the eastern part of the alliance are extremely concerned. They are close to this, the fighting in Ukraine, and they also border Russia, and they have seen not only the military build-up and the ongoing war in Ukraine, but they also seen the very threatening rhetoric. Because this goes far beyond Ukraine. This is about how Russia is actually challenging, contesting core values for our security, and demanding that NATO should withdraw all forces and infrastructure from almost half of our members. And they stated that if we don't do that, if we don't meet their demands, there will be what they call military technical consequences. So we have to take this seriously, and that's exactly why we are now deploying the NATO Response Force for the first time in a collective defense context, and we speak about thousands of troops. We speak about air and maritime capabilities. They are already actually part of the standing naval groups. We have many planes operating in the eastern part of the alliance, and then several allies have partly already assigned troops and forces to the NATO response force. We have the lead elements, which are led by France. We have the United States, which has assigned thousands of troops to the NATO response force, and these will be deployed to different places in the eastern part of the alliance. Well, they are partly coming from the United States, but these are also very much European troops. For instance, the lead element, the VJTF, the High Readiness Joint Task Force, is now led by France. There's a strong German component there, and other allies also part of that.
Associated Press.
Lorne Cook, Associated Press. Just to follow up on that, Secretary General, the VJTF can only go to one place, and you have 8 allies that are extremely nervous. I mean, where might you send it? Have you identified a particular weakness on that eastern flank? Thank you.
But I think we have to understand that we have many elements, components of the NATO response force. We have increased the readiness of the NATO response force, and then I don't speak only about the lead element or the VJTF, the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, but we speak about more elements than just that one. Second, we have allies, the United States, but also the United Kingdom and other allies that have increased the readiness of forces that are assigned to NATO and the NATO response force. So, of course, these are additional forces that we can deploy as part of the broader deployment of the NATO response force. I'm not saying that we are deploying the whole force. The size of the NATO response force has been tripled since 2014 to roughly 40,000 troops. I'm not saying we are deploying the whole thing. I'm saying that we are deploying elements of the lead, also the VJTF, and elements of the rest of the NATO response force. And then it is for SACEUR to make fine decisions exactly where the different elements are deployed, but we activated the defense plans yesterday, and now the elements of this force will be deployed, or is being deployed.
Okay, we'll go to TV2. Lady in white. Lady in white over there.
Thanks, Elin Sørsdal, TV2 Norway. I'll just follow up on AP and what Terry from NPR said. How quick can these troops and this force be deployed?
But some of these forces are already operating because we have sea and air forces, which are also already part of the NATO maritime forces operating from the Barents Sea down to the Mediterranean. Some are air forces, the air component of the NATO response force. And then some of the land forces are also can move within a few days. Because they are part of either the lead element, which has already high readiness, or the other elements that has been put on high readiness. So we speak about days, and some are already operating because we have increased our presence already.
Okay, we'll try to take a couple of questions online. We'll go first to Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, Thomas Kutschka.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon. Secretary General, in the statement that has just been released, it is said that Russia's actions are flagrant rejection of the principles enshrined in the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And then it continues, it is Russia that has walked away from its commitments under the Act. Does that mean that NATO now considers the NATO-Russia Founding Act as obsolete, or do NATO member states are they still bound? Do they still feel bound by this document? Thanks a lot.
The NATO leaders decided today a statement where they clearly state the fact that Russia has walked away. The NATO-Russia Founding Act is based on some core principles enshrined in the Founding Act, and that is the respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries, including, of course, Ukraine. And this has been violated not once but twice, and actually been constantly violated since 2014, with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the continued presence of Russian forces and Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukrainian Donbass. And this is further violated with the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine that we have seen over the last couple of days. So what we see is that Russia show no respect for the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And of course, if you have a founding act between two partners, NATO and Russia, and one part doesn't respect that agreement, the agreement doesn't work. It doesn't function. It doesn't help us to improve our relationship with Russia. Because even if the founding act has good provisions and good intentions, if these intentions and the provisions and the founding act is not respected, it doesn't work. So that's the reality. The NATO-Russia Founding Act doesn't work because one side, Russia, has violated it over many years, but now we see an extremely blatant and flagrant violation of the Founding Act with the invasion of Ukraine.
We'll take the next question online also from Greg Palkett from Fox.
Thank you, Juana. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Two quick questions, one about war, one about peace. Do you agree with some reports of intelligence officials that Kyiv could fall within the next, say, day or two? And despite the bravery of the fighting that you have cited among Ukrainian soldiers, do you see a defeat inevitable if war goes on? And the quick question about peace, there is discussion, President Zelensky offering to discuss with Russia an approach to peace that might include neutrality for Ukraine. Would you agree to something like that? Thank you.
The first on the situation on the ground. It is a full invasion of Ukraine. They are moving towards Kiev, and the stated goal is to change the government of Ukraine. It is a very unpredictable situation, therefore I will not speculate, but I will pay my respect to the Ukrainian armed forces, which are really proving their bravery and their courage by fighting and standing up against the much larger invading Russian force. On potential talks between the government of Ukraine, President Zelensky and Russia, my main message is that this is for President Zelensky and the government of Ukraine to decide. What we need to see now is that Russia stop the attack against Ukraine, that they withdraw their forces and cease all the attacks on Ukraine. That's the easiest, the fastest and the best way to peace. So if they want peace, then it's just stop to attack Ukraine. And therefore we call on Russia to do exactly that.
Okay, we'll go to NTV.
Yes, Sonomot from NTV. Secretary General, two short questions. First, you're a statistician, and so far with regard to risk, you have already evaluated the risk and the threat against NATO coming from Russia. Particularly, you foresee the playbook of Russia. And so my first question is, what is the risk that this conflict spread where and what might be the end goal of Russia? And my second question is, you have at the tip of your fingers the security of 1 billion citizens in the transatlantic area. So you met with on VTC all the leaders. Can you reassure the public opinion that if there is a genuine threat coming from, because the rhetoric, the aggressive rhetoric of Russia, its behavior is unacceptable, that all member states are committed to defend and protect every single centimeter of NATO? Thank you.
In the meeting today with NATO leaders, it was a very strong message of unity, a very strong message of resolve that we need to stand together, not only in words but also in deeds. So we agreed a strong statement calling on Russia to stop the attacks on Ukraine, to withdraw its forces, but also we agreed to continue to provide support to Ukraine and also continue to strengthen our presence in the eastern part of the alliance to prevent any attack on any NATO allied country. We have a defensive presence in the east. We are increasing our presence not to provoke a conflict but to prevent a conflict, and as long as there is no doubt about NATO's readiness to protect and defend all allies and our commitment to the core message, the core task of NATO, one for all for one, an attack on one ally will be regarded as an attack on all, then no ally will be attacked, and that will prevent the conflict, and that will preserve peace for NATO allies and for 1 billion people. And that's the reason why we communicate so clearly, and that's the reason why we are deploying more troops in the eastern part of the alliance, to make sure that there is no possibility to misunderstand our readiness to protect and defend all allies. And again, this is to preserve peace, to prevent an attack, and to prevent that the war which is going on in Ukraine spill over to any NATO allied country. And that was the message from NATO leaders today. That was also the message when I met with many of them in the G7 yesterday. And that is also, of course, a message when we speak to close partners, Finland, Sweden, and the European Union, because we all are concerned, and Russia's attack on Ukraine is more than an attack on Ukraine. It's a devastating, horrendous attack on innocent people in Ukraine, but it's also an attack on the whole European security order, and that's the reason why we take it so extremely seriously.
Deutsche Welle.
Thank you, Alexandra von Nahm, Deutsche Welle. Secretary General, one question on Ukraine's request for Turkey to close the Bosporus for Russian warships. Was that discussed today? And one follow-up on the question just asked. We heard today from the Lithuanian foreign minister saying that when we lose Ukraine today, we will be fighting for NATO later. Would you say that the statement is exaggerated? Thank you.
So on the Bosporus, that was not an issue. The potential attack or any potential attack on a NATO allied country, well, also, that has been our message throughout the whole day. That was the message from the NATO leaders in the summit today, is that we are there to protect and defend all allies. NATO is the strongest military alliance in the world. And make no mistake, we are there to protect and defend all allies and every inch of NATO territory. And we convey that message again and again, both in words but also in deeds. And that's the way to prevent a war, that's the way to prevent an attack, to preserve peace, and we have done so for more than 70 years, and we will continue to do it also in the light of the attack on Ukraine.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference.
Thank you so much.
afternoon here in Washington, D.C., quiet and sunny. But in Ukraine, it's the second or third almost day of war that Russia started against our country. I would like to thank all of the mass media here for keeping very close attention and helping to inform all the Americans, but also your international audiences, about the recent developments in Ukraine, about all the crimes that Russia is doing now against our country, but also about our fight and about our resistance. As I said during the last 48 hours, Ukraine has been victim of unprovoked aggression by Russian Federation. The second day was even harder. The attacks have been more brutal, but I'm very pleased to say that they were not successful, definitely not successful as the enemy planned them. So the picture of air raids, tank marches and rocket shelling of Ukrainian cities are reminiscent of the scenes that the world community has not seen since the World War II. And I'm sure that, like all people in Ukraine, people throughout the globe, in Europe, and definitely here in the United States, are surprised to see, or shocked, I should say, to see these battles in the streets of Kiev and around Kiev, but also everywhere in Ukraine. In the last 48 hours, but especially in the last 24 hours, the intense battles continued in Cherkasy, Chernihiv, Mariupol, Kherson, Kharkiv, and other cities of Ukraine. But I want to assure you that the spirit of Ukrainian army and the spirit of Ukrainian people and the spirit of Ukrainian territorial defense remain strong. The commendable fighting spirit has been demonstrated yesterday when 13 soldiers were posted on the Serpent Island on the south of Ukraine. It's a small Ukrainian border patrol outpost in Black Sea. They all refused to surrender to the Russian battleship. They all were killed, and our president just recently said that all these 13 people will be the heroes of Ukraine, and they will be recognized as heroes of Ukraine. But moreover, every Ukrainian, woman and man, who are fighting today for our country, they all are heroes, and we all are defending our home. The enemy is clearly surprised by the resolve of the Ukrainian armed forces and volunteers to protect integrity of our country. We see that they didn't advance the way they planned. We see that the advances, even though are massive, as we describe to you on a regular basis, from south, from east, from north, and massive attack from the air, these advances are not as successful. Although the Russian propaganda machine attempts to convince the world that civilian population was not targeted, I want to tell you directly that this is simply not true. And the last events of the last night here, but day and night in Ukraine, brought more horrific scenes of the Russian war crimes. So, first of all, we have many people right now not living their day-to-day lives, but actually spending the majority of their time in the basements or taking shelter in the metro stations or other safe locations. The Russian Hail multi-rocket launcher system hit residential infrastructure in Okhtyrka town in Sumy Oblast. Several children were heavily wounded. As a result of this Russian shelling in Okhtyrka, the strategic gas pipeline also got under threat, and we already warned all the proper authorities about the potential risk, not only for Ukraine and for that region, but in general for this critical civil infrastructure for the entire country. The enemy also hit the orphanage in Vorzel, Kiev region, where 50 children were in the orphanage at that moment. And it's only with God's help that these 50 children were not harmed and were not killed during this attack. Several ambulances in Zaporizhia, Kiev, and Donetsk Oblast were also hit by the enemy. In the attempt to cover up its crimes from their own people, because we all know the truth. And I know the information everywhere in Ukraine, but in Europe and especially here in the United States is open for the public, but they would like to cover it from their own people, from Russian people. So today the Russian authorities have decided to partially limit access to Facebook in Russia. Yet the international community already documented these crimes to prevent necessary evidence, to present necessary evidence against the Russian government, and our prosecutor general is collecting all the data and preparing it all for the international tribunals. We are particularly concerned by the situation in the Chernobyl power plant. We were informing the world starting from yesterday that there were fights for this power plant and that Russia completely took over the Chernobyl power plant and the exclusion zone yesterday. We're even more concerned because they took hostages 92 members of the operational personnel of Chernobyl power plant and contrary to the rules of how the personnel should work in shifts and all the very, very strict and regulations that they are not observed right now, and all responsibility for the Chernobyl power plant is now lies on the Russian forces and Russian army. But we are very concerned that the Chernobyl shelter is under threat of any type of random attack by the Russian Federation. So we are calling for all the international friends and partners to keep a close eye on that. Despite, again, all these activities, and despite the fact that Russian Federation increased the attack on all Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces managed not only to keep the situation under control, but significantly stop the Russian army and the advances of the Russian army. In the last 2 days together, we have destroyed 80 tanks, 10 airplanes, 7 helicopters, and 516 armed vehicles of the enemy. And as the result of Mr. Putin's decision to send Russians to kill Ukrainians, 2,800 of Russian soldiers will not be going back to Russia. Again, Ukraine is a peaceful country. We worked really hard to stop and prevent this war. We worked really hard to deter Russia from attacking our country, together with our friends and allies and all the international community. We never attacked anyone. We never attacked Russian Federation. This whole war that Russia started on Ukraine is unjust, unprovoked, and totally baseless. But at the same time, as our president and our chief commander said, since we were attacked and we are defending our home, we will be inflicting as many damages to the enemy as possible in order to defend our Ukraine. I would like also to say today how thankful we are to all of our friends and allies, and especially to the United States, our strategic partner, but I guess I should say our strategic friend. We have received not only significant defense assistance, financial assistance, and a clear support from the leadership. As we are talking to you today, our president just had yet another very productive call with President Biden, and we have discussed, they have discussed on this call the anti-war coalition and how we align all our plans, and we discussed the sanctions and more defense to Ukraine. But we also see that this anti-war coalition, which now includes 73 countries and 9 international organizations, is working hand in hand and very united to not only support and defend Ukraine, but also to support and defend the international law and support and defend the simple principle that any country that decided to be independent, to be sovereign, to be a democracy, to live how we would like to live in our country, has the right to do so without being attacked by a military power, by a nuclear power. So we already see today that the European Union European Union decided to freeze the assets of Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov, who are responsible for this decision to start the war. We strongly welcome the decision of the Council of Europe to expel Russia from its membership. As our Minister of Foreign Relations said, all the red lines have been crossed when Russia attacked us. So it's time not only to heavily sanction Russia, but it's also time to exclude them from any organizations where countries that are not peace-loving countries and countries that do not value peace and countries that attack other countries do not have the right to be. We are also thankful to all other friends and allies, and I don't want to miss someone here, but European Union, Canada, Great Britain, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all of you, thank you very much for all the support. And of course, we're grateful for this support, and we are working very closely with all of them in order to receive more support and in order to strengthen the sanctions against Russian Federation. Because as much as we see that the strong sanctions are implemented, they are affecting Russia already, but their behavior didn't stop. So the more strong sanctions should follow, and we work with our partners on that. On the additional measures, as I said, anything that we are focusing now on 3 key areas and we're helping all our friends and allies to work on those key 3 areas. One is punishing Russia for its action. Strong sanctions, strong messages from all international organizations, excluding Russia from all international organizations. Also, severing the diplomatic relations with Russia, and we see that some friends and allies are already there. We have to together say no to military aggression against one of the European countries in the middle of Europe. The second very important point is defense support to Ukraine. Our brave men and women, all of us, and since yesterday we have the overall mobilization in the country, so all Ukrainians, according to the decision to our president, supported by Ukrainian parliament, all Ukrainians are defending the country at the moment, either in the armed forces or territorial defense or everywhere where the help is needed right now. And we need all the support we can get from all of our friends and allies so we can sustain this defense action. And the third is, of course, the humanitarian assistance and financial assistance that we need in order to take care of our people who were forced to relocate within Ukraine, people whose daily life has been interrupted, people who have been wounded, and people who have to continue their lives and support our military, our armed forces. I would like to finish with saying that we're thankful to those Russian citizens who yesterday, in the last 2 days, went to the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg to protest against Putin's attack on Ukraine. Not as many as we would like to see, but we would like to say from Ukraine that we see you, and we noted that protest, and it gives us hope that this attack will not only be stopped by us and all the civilized world, but there are forces in Russia, there are citizens in Russia who do not want and do not support the brutal attack on its neighbors. Thank you very much, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Hi, I'm Tara McKelvey with the BBC. President Zelensky said that citizens in Ukraine should use Molotov cocktails to defend their homes, and the Ukrainian defense minister has asked Congress for additional Stingers and anti-aircraft weapons. Can you tell us what progress you're making in convincing Congress to give you the equipment, the military equipment that you're requesting?
Thank you. We have very productive discussions with the United States and with all of our friends and allies. We will be informing, of course, when there are decisions, but I want to say that, that the help that the United States has provided Ukraine, the 650 million worth of defense support in 2021, which is the highest number since 2014, and all the discussions that we have and all the support that we have from the United States right now is at a very high level. So we are working closely with our friends and colleagues here on the additional support.
Madam Ambassador, what was your reaction to President Biden's remarks yesterday, and when did he and President Zelensky last speak? You said that they spoke. Do you know when that last conversation was?
The last conversation was just a couple of 10-15 minutes ago. So if you would take a look, there is a tweet from our president, just a recent tweet about it. And you have to understand, the situation is very tense in Ukraine. And as you probably saw from the President Zelensky is tweeting and also doing the video messages to keep Ukrainians, but also to keep the rest of the world informed about what we are doing. President Zelensky is in Kyiv together with the head of our government. Just recently they put out a video in front of the president's office, essentially with a very simple message saying we're here, we're in Ukraine, we're in Kyiv, we defend our country, and we intend to continue doing so.
And my second question was, what were your reactions to President Biden's remarks yesterday? Do you think that he went far enough with President Putin?
Well, we are grateful for the sanctions. If you look at the sanctions, it covers a very broad range of topics. As a former Minister of Finance, I was very happy to see the sanctions against major Russian banks. I was very happy to see the export controls. I was very happy to see the personal sanctions and all of that. Now, we also heard from President Biden that it's a first wave of the strong sanctions package. So our reaction has been voiced by our president right away. We're very thankful for this very strong sanctions that will be heard and felt in Russia, and we look forward to the next waves.
Madam Ambassador, do you think, on her question, will those sanctions be strong enough? What is your impression as far as will that do what it needs to do to get the Russians to step back?
Look, there is only one person knows what we need to do for him to stop, and it's Mr. Putin. He's the one who started this war in 2014. He's the one who started this war in 2021 with the escalation. He's the one who started really hot, full-fledged war right now. So we can guess what will make him stop. But I think what we should do, and we should be very united in it, and that's why we're very happy that we have 73 countries together with us, so that we together can do and will do everything that it takes for him to stop, disappear from the territory of a sovereign country where he and his armed forces should not be, and stop this war against our country. Now, we will. There will be another event which you probably will be covering today, the meeting of the Security Council of the United Nations, where we will be discussing and hopefully adopting the resolution on this issue. And we also call on all of the friends and allies on the countries not only to co-author the resolution, but also be very strong and decisive, because we need all international platforms and venues at moments like this show that actually we together can react on this, we can react quick, and we can actually decisively take decisions.
Do you have a comment? Do you have a comment on where a diplomatic avenue might stand? Putin said he might still meet. Is that on the table at all?
As our president said, since he was elected in 2019, bringing peace to Ukraine is, and will always be his #1 priority. Number 2 is we've done everything since 2019 in order, even though, whether we might like them or not, but to comply with the Minsk Accords and ensure that we're moving forward in returning through diplomatic solution the territories of Donetsk and Lugansk. And we also started the Crimean platform to create another diplomatic platform and solution and path to return through diplomatic solution the Crimea, which also is illegally occupied and annexed by Russia. So our devotion and our president's devotion to peace does not need to be proven. During the past 3 years, that was his actions, all his actions were to actually get to lasting peace and through diplomatic solution to restore the territorial integrity of our country. Even days before Putin attacked us, our president was very public and always said that he's ready to meet with Mr. Putin and discuss these issues in a peaceful and diplomatic manner. Yesterday, again, in his public statement, our president said that we will defend our country. This is the priority number one right now. But of course, we are ready for the peace talks. Now, he also made very clear, we are ready for peace talks, but we are not ready to capitulate or surrender.
Ambassador.
After the NATO meeting, that not only the US but other allies will be providing us with additional defense equipment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Ambassador, just to follow up on that, what would you like to see NATO do? Would you like to see an expedited admission of Ukraine into NATO? Would you like to see NATO more aggressively deploy troops?
I think you know the answer, but let me answer it this way. In 2018, we changed our constitution and we included our desire to join European Union and NATO in our constitution. Our parliament did so because the majority of Ukrainians, 62%, actually support Ukraine joining the NATO. Now, NATO is an alliance, and we need the decision of all 30 members to accept us, and we have been on a very strong path towards working with our friends and allies in NATO on our plan to, in the future, become member of NATO. In 2020, Ukraine became the EOP partner with NATO, and that allowed us already to cooperate in so many areas, from training to getting our army more NATO compliant, to transforming the country. Because again, contrary to what Russians think, NATO is not a military alliance. NATO has so many other cooperation paths, especially focused on the rule of law and democracy and everything that we will be able to discuss with all of you when the war is over and when my country is free from the attack. But right now, of course, priority number one is to defend the country. So we are talking to all of the friends of allies, whether they are members of NATO or not members of NATO, to provide us with all the security and defense capabilities right now. And, as a citizen of Ukraine, of course, I hope that we soon will win, that the peace will return to the country, and then we will return to the discussions of so many strategic issues and items on the agenda, including the NATO membership.
Madam Ambassador, do you have an update on civilian casualties? And a second question, I've seen some Ukrainian activists call for a no-fly zone to be imposed over Ukraine. Is that something that your government is planning to ask for or that you would support?
Thank you. On the casualties, I do not have the numbers for you right now. You have to understand that we are collecting the information from everywhere, and I just want to only use the numbers. So as soon as closer to the end of the day in Ukraine, we will have the numbers, and we would be happy to share it with you. It has been very hard this day, especially when Russians deliberately targeted some of the civilian infrastructures and hospitals and emergency rooms and others. It has been very hard. A no-fly zone. No-fly zone. Well, there are so many things we are talking about with all of our friends and allies, and of course, as a country that is attacked, is fighting for our existence right now against a much stronger enemy, we are discussing and we are asking our friends and allies for any type of support or any type of sanctions or restrictions that they might provide. Now, I will not be discussing the specific of them, because I think it's also very important for us to stay united, to discuss them and implement them when we all agree on what is it that we together, as the anti-war and anti-Putin coalition, are ready to do.
Madam Ambassador, can you give an update on the security situation in and around Kyiv? How are you holding out? How long do you expect you can hold out for?
Well, Kyiv has been Ukrainian for the past couple of thousand years, and we intend to keep it for the next couple of thousand years. But the situation in Kyiv, of course, is very difficult right now. There has been air assault on Kyiv. There is destruction of the civilian infrastructure. There were groups that tried to get into Kyiv, and some of them got into some parts of Kyiv. So there was a combat in some parts of Kyiv, but Kyiv is fully under control of Ukrainian armed forces, the National Guard, territorial defense, and even though the situation is remain tense, because as we all heard from Mr. Putin's speech, that is his goal. His goal is to attack all Ukraine, his goal is to capture Kyiv, and his goal is to have a pro-Russian government in Kyiv. Now, all three of those we Ukrainians not only believe is not possible, but together with our armed forces, we are doing everything possible to prevent that from happening.
Madam Ambassador, last night the President said to EU leaders that this may be the last time that they see him alive. With that in mind, is President Zelensky still in Kyiv? Does he plan to stay there? Is there a discussion of him sort of retrenching to the west or going somewhere else?
President Zelensky is in Kyiv. He regularly records the messages from Kyiv, and he intends to stay there, and our armed forces also intend, as well as all people who live in Kyiv, to fiercely defend our capital.
Madam Ambassador,
you talked about the possibility of a meeting with Russian President Putin. To what extent, I mean, does your government believe that that's a legitimate offer to speak, to negotiate? I know you said not to capitulate, but the idea of Minsk as a venue in particular, does that strike the Ukrainian government as a legitimate option?
Well, the only thing I can say now is what our president said, that at any stage we are ready to, of course, for peace talks, but we are not ready to capitulate or we are not ready to surrender. When we have, or if we have more information about that, because we only heard what we heard, like you, in the press.
But there have not been any direct communications about potentially setting anything up, even through
Nothing I can share with you now. More questions?
Can you authenticate that the now famous audio clip from Serpent Island is authentic? The F Russia, is that an authentic tape or is that disinformation?
It was shared by our commander-in-chief, and we're proud that those 13 military men responded like they should have responded to a proposal to surrender.
Okay, so you're authenticating that as an accurate tape, clip, audio clip. It's not made up or after the fact.
Well, you know, being in Washington, D.C., I cannot check personally to authenticate, but yes, it's it was shared by the official sources of Ukraine.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow up on the disinformation, we've heard warnings that Russia would attempt to demoralize Ukrainian forces with false reports of surrenders or anything. Are you seeing any evidence that is occurring?
We see the attempts, but we know that so far, during the 48 hours, only people who surrendered, and we have it on the video, and we have actually them in captivity, are the Russian forces. So we also would like here to ask all of you to take information from the official sources from Ukraine. Our commander-in-chief, our territorial defense, our armed forces, they all are very active and putting all the information in Ukrainian, English and other languages, and we also duplicate it on the embassy resources on a regular basis. So please take it from there, and our security service is also monitoring closely all the disinformation attacks, because again, this attack, even though now we all focused, of course, on the direct military attack, but the hybrid attack didn't disappear from there. So they're trying to spread the disinformation, they're trying to spread fakes, that's why in Ukraine, and I also want to tell you that all Ukrainian channels now work as one. They united not only our political parties, all united, not only our parliamentary groups united and work together in light of this attack, but also all the TV stations in Ukraine now work together and provide our citizens with the up-to-date, correct information on a regular basis, plus informing citizens what they should do, where they should go, what are the numbers to contact, also on a regular basis. So, we know that there is a lot of many disinformation efforts, but we seem to battle them quite successfully for the moment.
And Madam Ambassador, on Chernobyl, have you received any guidance from the United States or NATO, considering there is fighting going on there and how delicate that region is? Has anyone reached out to give you some next steps and share intelligence, that sort of thing, about that specific area?
Well, we are reaching out to everyone, and we're informing everyone and all the regulatory bodies that have to do with, especially the nuclear stations. Again, nuclear industry is quite large in Ukraine. A large portion of our electricity generation is nuclear. We have quite a number of power plants. That's why we put special emphasis on guarding them against the enemy, so that we responsibly can run them even during the time of these attacks. So with the Chernobyl plant, our National Guard fiercely defended it until it was taken over. But again, in defending these plants, we are trying to be very responsible and careful so that there is no damage to it. We cannot say the same about Russian Federation, so that's why we are warning and that's why we are reaching out to everyone. So this is the issue that has to be discussed, that Russia has to be specifically pressed on this particular topic.
And have you gotten a response from anyone?
Пані Басов, скажіть, будь ласка, багато українців зараз, Сполучені Штати сказали, нададуть притулок, якщо це потрібно українцям. Але багато хто хоче повернутися додому, але не може. Зараз повітряний простір закритий, у когось, можливо, закінчуються візи. Як діяти в таких ситуаціях українцям, які застрягли, заблоковані зараз тут?
Would you like me to answer in English or in Ukrainian? If in Ukrainian, I can stay and answer later on, so that. But the question was that many Ukrainians are leaving the country now, looking for essentially saving their children from the attacks, and some Ukrainians want to come back, but because there is no air flights to Kyiv, it's also difficult. So. And the question was what we can recommend as the embassy. So first I would like to ask all Ukrainian citizens here in the United States, be in contact with the embassy, our consulate here in Washington DC, but also in Chicago, in San Francisco, in Houston and in New York, are working 24/7. We also at the 24/7 regime like all Ukraine right now. So any questions that Ukrainian citizens have here, please contact us. We would be happy to assist. Second, yes, there are many Ukrainians who are actually coming back home now to fight for their country. And even though there are no flights, they are all flying to the closest European places, and there is no problem with crossing the border. So we know many Ukrainians who, as we speak, are flying back home and will be in Ukraine through any checkpoints on the western border. And on people who are taking the kids out, and we're very grateful to the neighboring countries for the help that they're providing these people while they temporarily leave the country. Now it's understood that if it's old people or women or small kids, we value every life of Ukrainian, and we would like to protect every life of Ukrainian. So we are making everything possible. Plus the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine today had a special meeting, and they actually, made it easier to deal with quite a number of procedures and processes that are required to get the humanitarian assistance into the country. So that we can be more effective in supplying our people. And we are working with the United States, by the way, actively through USAID, and I had a very productive call yesterday with Ambassador Power, who's coordinating the assistance that the US can provide us on this very important topic.
Ambassador, on that note, can you give us an update about the humanitarian situation? How many people have already been displaced? What specific requests are you asking for from the US?
I cannot tell you the numbers again, and I don't want to speculate here. But on the humanitarian assistance, again, we have the couple of ministers, the Minister of Social Policy, the Vice Prime Minister on reintegrated territories, and the Vice Prime Minister on European integration. They together, under the orders from the President and Prime Minister, are working now on actually putting quickly together the needs, getting the supplies that are necessary, and of course we have to, we are working how to spread it within the country quickly.
Madam Ambassador, you said that President Zelensky is in the country and with no plans to surrender. Is he willing to fight to the death? Like, what is the exit strategy or point, what's the point of surrender?
The strategy that President and all Ukrainians have is to fight until our victory. And we would like, together with our friends, allies and partners, and definitely together with all of our armed forces, to get there faster, so we are not losing the bravest and the best that we have in our armed forces.
Madam Ambassador, how many of your military have been killed to date? You said 2,800 Russians won't be going home. How many of your soldiers have died?
We will have the number later on, so I only have the yesterday's number, and I don't want to share the old information.
Fair enough.
Madam Ambassador, on the call that happened with President Biden, do you have any other insight you can share on how that went? I know we saw the tweet from President Zelensky. And then also, are you getting the intelligence, are the allies sharing enough intelligence with Ukraine and getting everything they need in that way?
Well,
You're asking for more.
the call has been very productive. You saw the tweet. The president said, the president expressed gratitude to the U.S. for the support, and we discussed the 3 items which are the important items on the agenda: the defense supplies, the sanctions, and other items on the bilateral agenda. How can we move this anti-war, anti-Putin coalition forward? So it has been a very good call, and again, under the circumstances, also you have to understand that it's not easy to conduct phone calls and meetings when your city is being bombed by the rockets and missiles by the enemy. But it was a very good call, and we are very closely cooperating on the situation, sharing the information and discussing the needs that Ukraine has now in order to continue. Thank you. Thank you very much again. Thank you for coming. We will be sending, if you would like us to send you more information, please leave your emails with our press secretary, so that when we have updates, you don't have to come here, but we can actually email you quickly. And then hopefully we'll see each other either tomorrow or soon. Thank you.
He didn't account for the bravery and resolve of the people of Ukraine. We commend the Ukrainian people for showing strength and determination in response to an unprovoked attack by the Kremlin. We have seen Ukrainian soldiers demonstrate incredible bravery in the first day of self-defense, shooting down Russian aircraft, firing at tanks, and holding many of the positions while under violent assault. The Kremlin continues to use disinformation, including false reports alleging, again falsely, the widespread surrender of Ukrainian troops. Moscow is resorting to outright lies in an effort to weaken the resolve of Ukraine's military and of its people. We are also witting of reports that the Russian Federation plans to threaten to kill the family members of Ukrainian soldiers if they do not surrender. These tactics are classic intimidation They are synonymous with the Kremlin. They are unacceptable. This isn't the first time, of course, Putin has decided that his country can attack another country with impunity. Moscow's further invasion of Ukraine is part of a pattern of the Kremlin's of destructive behavior. The Russian Federation, of course, invaded Georgia in 2008. It continues to occupy territories within Georgia's borders, and for decades it has stationed troops in Moldova without host government consent. Tomorrow, the United States will join Ukraine in solemnly marking the 8th anniversary of Russia's 2014 invasion and brutal occupation of Crimea, a flagrant disregard for international law, as well as Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States reaffirms, as we always have, Crimea is Ukraine. The Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence, and while building their democracy, they have shown relentless and inspiring pursuit of liberty, of peace, of security, of human dignity, and they continue to show that they will not go back in time. As we approach the 7th anniversary of the brutal murder of Boris Nemtsov, we are reminded that many Russians disagree with Putin's brutal and imperialist tactics and policies. The citizens of Russia who are peacefully protesting, including in Putin's own hometown and in dozens of other cities across the Russian Federation, are rejecting his violence against the people of Ukraine. We deeply respect them. We respect their bravery. We respect their heroism. They are out in the streets demanding that Russia's government, their government, stop this unprovoked and unjustified war. We've seen leading Russian journalists denouncing Putin's war of choice. We have heard of Russia's mothers concerned about the reckless deployment of their sons to a needless war. These courageous people of conscience in Russia persist. They persist despite the Kremlin's reinvigorated crackdown. This, too, is classic from Putin's playbook. Whenever challenged by people, his own people, speaking truth and opposing views, his tactic is to silence them. The people of Russia, as we have said time and again, are not our enemy. We hold President Putin and his cronies responsible for this war, not them. We join you in saying no to war. Niet vnia. President Biden has said from the start of this crisis, if President Putin chooses to invade, the cost to Russia will be immediate and profound. To its financial system, to its economy, to its technological base, and to its strategic position and ambitions, as well as its reputation in the world. And the world has now witnessed that Putin has made a choice. He rejected diplomacy, he has chosen war, and President Biden has announced our response. To be clear, this is not the outcome we wanted. This is not the outcome we sought to prevent. It's both a tragedy for the people of Ukraine and a choice Putin made that he has decided for the people of Russia. This is a choice that has been decided for them, not by them. Putin's war of choice has required that we follow through on imposing the massive consequences and severe costs, and that we ensure his flagrant violation of international law will be a strategic failure. We stand united with our NATO allies and partners in Europe and around the world in confronting the Russian government and holding President Putin and those around him to account.
Thanks, Ned. I just want to, I think you might have misspoken. This is the outcome you sought to prevent, right?
This is the outcome that we sought to prevent.
Can I ask you, this may be already kind of OBE, but you know, there was this proposal, the Chinese and the Chinese proposal the Russians seem to have picked up on, at least for an hour or so, about talks between Russia and Ukraine happening in Minsk. I know the Secretary spoke to Foreign Minister Kuleba today. What's the U.S., what's your thinking about the efficacy of such talks?
Well, Matt, you've heard us say before that over the course of several weeks leading up to the events that we've seen recently in Ukraine, the assault on Ukraine, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and really its people, that Moscow engaged in a pretense of diplomacy. That was before the invasion started. Now we see Moscow suggesting that diplomacy take place at the barrel of a gun or as Moscow's rockets, mortars, artillery target the Ukrainian people. This is not real diplomacy. Those are not the conditions for real diplomacy. We and our allies have called for a real diplomatic solution from day one. President Zelensky, for his part, has repeatedly reached out to President Putin, but his outstretched hand at every turn was met now by silence and now bombs. If President Putin is serious about diplomacy, he knows what he can do. He should immediately stop the bombing campaign against civilians, order the withdrawal of his forces from Ukraine, and indicate very clearly, unambiguously to the world that Moscow is prepared to de-escalate. We have not seen that yet.
So you don't think it's a good idea?
We have not seen any indication that Putin is prepared to de-escalate. We have not seen any indication that he is willing to create the conditions in which diplomacy can succeed.
Just to put a super fine point on it, it is not the question of the venue. You know, if the same talks without some kind of significant change from the Russians, you don't think talks anywhere?
This is a question that is much more fundamental than the venue. This is a question of whether diplomacy can succeed under these conditions. We do not think it can.
Okay. Then just secondly and finally for me, Finland and Sweden were invited to participate in this NATO meeting in Brussels earlier today. And the Russians have, I don't know, issued a warning, you know, saying that if they were to join NATO, and I know that there isn't any current plan for them to do so, but if they were, that there would be repercussions, military and political repercussions for them. Now, I'm not going to ask you whether the U.S. would encourage or support Finland or Sweden to join NATO, but there are conditions that have to be satisfied. For aspirants have to satisfy certain conditions to become members. Do Finland and Sweden currently, as they are now, meet those conditions for membership?
That is a question, Matt, for NATO, but there is a more fundamental question that your question actually gets at. And that is really what is at stake in this conflict. We have made the point before that Ukraine is a valued partner of the United States. Its people are partners of the American people. But this, in some ways, in many ways, is bigger than a territorial conflict between Russia in Ukraine. It is bigger because these are about the foundational principles that for 70 years now, since the end, over the course of 2 world wars and since the end of the Cold War, principles that have undergirded and really fueled unprecedented levels of stability, of prosperity, of security the world over, in Europe, Indo-Pacific, and everywhere in between. That is what Putin is threatening. In addition to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, what Putin is threatening is this rules-based international order. And one of the central precepts of that rules-based international order is the foundational truth that every country should be free to determine its own policies, its own domestic policy, its own foreign policies, its partnerships, its alliances, its associations, its aspirations. That is what Putin has sought to trample on in Ukraine. It is what, if we are to listen to at least this bluster, we may be led to believe he wants to trample on beyond Ukraine.
I get that, but that's not, my question is about Finland and Sweden. It's not about what Putin's policies are. You know, Ukraine has made it very clear that it wants to, or the current government of Ukraine has made it very clear that it wants to join NATO, and NATO has said, no, you're not ready yet. And what my question is if, and I know you're not going to want to answer a hypothetical, but if you're going to say no, do Finland and Sweden meet the criteria for NATO membership?
So first,
should they apply tomorrow? Would they have to, would they have to do, are they democratic enough?
So
do they uphold human rights? Do they?
So let me make 3 points. It is up to Finland and Sweden to determine for themselves if they wish to join NATO or any other alliance. It is our firm position and a firm position of the NATO alliance that NATO's door remains open to all eligible aspirants. And three, ultimately, if a country does aspire for NATO membership, that's a decision for NATO, not for any other country.
I just want to know, which would the United States support? You don't support Ukraine's membership in NATO right now.
Matt, you yourself have just said that neither Finland nor Sweden have indicated that they aspire to join NATO.
So that's why I tried to couch the question of whether they would currently meet the criteria to become.
I am going to let Finland and Sweden speak for themselves. Yes, Vivian.
Thanks, Ned. The EU has moved to impose sanctions on Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov today. The president said obviously it was under consideration yesterday. There are reports that the U.S. will announce sanctions on Putin today. Can you tell us if that is the case?
As you heard from the president yesterday, all options are on the table. All options means all. All means all. We are looking closely at additional options that may apply appropriate pressure to the Russian Federation, to President Putin, to those around him. But any additional measures would join a litany of steps that, together with our EU allies, with Australia, with Canada, with Great Britain, with New Zealand, and a number of other countries, we announced yesterday that constitute the strongest, most consequential set of sanctions and other economic measures ever imposed. And the fact that they are responsive to this brazen, brutal, unprovoked aggression on the part of Russia against Ukraine speaks to their strength and why that strength was and is necessary. So any additional measures would complement the fact that we announced yesterday that now all 10 of Russia's largest bank, which hold 80% of the assets in Russia's banking sector, are now subject to these measures. The export controls that we have the Department of Commerce, to be specific, imposed yesterday now block the import of some 50% of the strategic imports that Moscow would need for its strategic positioning, its strategic ambitions. The fact that the Russian government is now cut off in terms of its sovereign debt from Western financing. The fact that elites around President Putin are now sanctioned and subject to those attendant restrictions. Any additional measures, and again, we have said that if President Putin continues to escalate, we will do the same, but any additional measures would join that long litany of steps that already constitute the strongest, the most decisive response that the United States, and together with our allies and partners, have ever mounted. Humar.
So I have a couple of follow-ups on both of those issues, but before, please indulge me. Foreign Policy magazine first reported this about locally employed staff working in Ukraine and how they're seeking U.S. help. So what is the plan for them? How many people are we talking about? And what is your assessment? Do you not think you have an obligation to these people?
Humaira, the Secretary and others from here have been in regular touch with the Embassy Kyiv community, and that, of course, includes our locally employed staff. You've traveled with us. You know the value that the Secretary, that the team around him attach to our locally employed staff. They are at the heart of our embassy operations around the world. Quite simply, our embassies, our posts around the world could not function without our locally employed staff. On February 24th, a couple days ago, the Locally Employed Staff Committee sent us an email following Russia's unprovoked attack against Kyiv. We are exploring all legal options available to us that would enable us to support them at what clearly is a very difficult time for our locally employed staff. We've already taken some important steps. We've implemented paid administrative leave for all staff unable to work or telework, regardless of their location. Whether our local staff are working, whether they're teleworking, whether they are unable to work, let me be clear, they are being paid. Whether they are in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine, they are being paid. We have established a dedicated communications channel for all of our locally employed staff to contact us with their questions, with their concerns, so that we can be responsive directly to them. And we've provided the option of salary advances to support those locally employed staff who need an extra amount of assistance at what is clearly a very difficult time. So these relationships are deeply meaningful to us. They're deeply important to us. Again, our operations could not continue without our locally employed staff.
How many people are we talking about?
Now, I'm not in a position to offer that. All of them are being paid. All of them have these options available to them.
Okay.
Sure.
Can I just do one quick question on that?
Sure.
First? Okay. One thing that they asked for specifically in this letter was assistance relocating out of the country. The Biden administration has been talking about this potential assault for weeks, now. So why isn't there already a way to help these local employed staff get out of the country if they want to, and do you plan on doing that?
Well, we are exploring all options that are legally available to us and that are logistically available to us at this time. As you know, we have, for over the course of weeks now, been issuing public communications directed in the first instance at the American citizen community in Kyiv, those who otherwise would have traveled to Ukraine, urging individuals not to travel to Ukraine, and more recently urging Americans located in Ukraine to depart Ukraine. We have, of course, provided guidance to our locally engaged staff, locally employed staff, who had come to us seeking guidance, seeking direction. So I can't speak to specific cases. I can't speak to specific decisions or choices that may have been made, but we are here to support them in every conceivable way that we can.
That raises actually they'd be specifically subject to Russian aggression.
I'm sorry?
Is there any reason to believe that these locally employed staff would be specifically subject to Russian aggressions?
I have not seen any indication that they would be targeted for their role, but we have seen every indication that this is intended to be on the part of the Russian Federation, not only an assault on Ukraine's territorial integrity, not only an assault on its government, but also an assault on the Ukrainian people. So we are deeply concerned about the intentions, the motivations of the Russian Federation. It's why we are seeking to bring this unprovoked, needless war to an end as quickly as we can. Humera.
Just on this, do you know, were there any local staff who accompanied the people who went to Lviv and were working in Lviv and that, who have since now been relocated basically to Poland and who would have gone and are now temporarily at least living in Poland?
It was a core embassy team, Matt. That
just Americans, or were there local staff too?
It was a core embassy team. I'm not in a position to offer if there were any locally employed staff with them. Humera.
Just to close the loop on sanctions, and then I'll move on to UN very briefly. So the assessments out there about how long it would take Russian forces to overrun Kyiv is mentioned like in days. And yet the president and others in this government said yesterday sanctions would be more impactful in time. Is it fair to say then in the immediate term, U.S. is basically unable to stop Putin?
I don't think you heard anyone say that. What you have heard us say is that, well, let me back up. Over the course of months now, we have been ringing the alarm bell as we had information available to us as early as late last year that Vladimir Putin had these intentions. We started to see his forces mobilize around that time. You remember in November of 2021 when we first started to speak about this publicly. Beyond our public messaging, we engaged in robust private diplomacy behind closed doors to ensure that our allies and partners around the world knew what we knew so that we could operate in tandem with one another. When it comes to the sanctions that you mentioned, these were coordinated with allies and partners around the world. Part of what gives them the bite, the heft that they have, is that these were not just measures that were introduced by the United States, but also by the European Union.
It doesn't matter how many people, how many countries introduce that. It's a matter of time. And we're talking about days, and President openly said that they don't have the days.
But you will look, if you see what has transpired in the Russian marketplace over the course not only of recent days, but of recent weeks. The threat of these massive consequences have pushed the ruble to its lowest levels in years, pushed the Russian stock market, pushed down investor sentiment, and have made clear that these measures have tremendous bite. And we saw that yesterday when these measures were introduced. So what is true is that these measures are designed to garner strength, to garner momentum over time. But with their immediate introduction yesterday, on top of the measures that we imposed on Monday in response to President Putin's recognition of these so-called republics in eastern Ukraine, you have seen that there has been an immediate effect. There has been an immediate bite.
My final one is on UN. The vote is delayed for an hour. Do you know why?
I do not. You would need to
Are you
ask the UN.
confident you've got UAE and India to vote yes?
We are confident that the Russian Federation will be and will be shown to be isolated on the world stage. We are confident that our partners, that our allies around the world will stand in very clear, very stark opposition to this aggression, to this assault on Ukraine's territorial integrity, to its independence, to its sovereignty. We have every expectation that message will emanate loud and clear from this UN session.
All your partners, including India and UAE.
We have every expectation that message will be loud and clear to the Russian Federation, unambiguous to President Putin. Yes.
Can I follow up on something that you said when you were speaking with Matt? You said if you were to listen to the blunder of President Putin, you might believe he was willing to go beyond Ukraine. Do you have reason to believe that that is the case?
President Putin knows, because we have stated very clearly that our commitment to NATO's Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, is as vibrant, is as sacrosanct as it was at NATO's founding some 7 decades ago. You heard the president say again yesterday that we will fight for every inch of NATO territory. That is a message that we have made very clear in public. It is a message that we have conveyed very clearly in private. I have no doubt that message has reached President Putin.
And one separate question. I want to do a follow-up.
Is there anything specific to indicate? The NATO Secretary General said today that there are indications that the Kremlin's objectives spanned beyond Ukraine. Is there anything to suggest from the U.S.'s perspective that they do?
Well, what we have seen from President Putin, not only in recent days, but in recent years, is his desire to go back to an era that has long since passed, an era in which spheres of influence are acceptable, an era in which large countries can bully small countries, an era in which might equals right. That is an era that should have ended, certainly with the fall of the Berlin Wall, certainly with the end of the Cold War. But, of course, President Putin has other desires, other aspirations. It is our task to reinforce the rules that have, again, governed the international community over the course of some 70 years, but certainly in more recent years since the end of the Cold War. Abigail.
Can you give us any update on your efforts to help Americans who are still in Ukraine? I know you are always hesitant to give exact numbers, but do you have any further indication of how many Americans have crossed over the border into Poland, for instance?
So, as you've heard us say, we don't have precise figures in any country around the world of the number of Americans who are present in a foreign country at any given time. And you know those reasons well. We don't track Americans. We don't require them to register. We don't require them to unregister when they leave a country. In the case of Ukraine, however, we did have an estimate, and we do have an estimate, dated from October of last year of Americans resident in Ukraine. At the time, October of 2021, there were 6,600 Americans resident in Ukraine by our estimation. And that estimation was based on data from our Ukrainian partners. It was based on data that was available to us as well, including data from local organizations. That same month, October of 2021, is this very same month that we started warning Americans not to travel to Ukraine. It was those warnings were later superseded by clear and consistent encouragement to Americans to leave the country, and most recently warnings that Americans should leave the country. So since October of 2021, we have seen a sweeping shift in the advice and guidance we have provided to Americans who either sought to travel to Ukraine or Americans who might have been resident in Ukraine. So while we don't have a firm number of Americans who are there, we have good reason to believe, and I think all of you have good reason to conclude, that the number of Americans in Ukraine now is far lower than 6,600. What we have been doing over the course of weeks now is communicating with Americans who are located in Ukraine, asking them to be in touch with us, providing us their contact information so that we in turn can provide them specific, tailored guidance about what they should do to